people who are waiting to get in, and these are called public hearings.
But when the limit is different times is like this. Two times together. Ma'am?
Just tell them you're with Turning Point USA. And you give us oh, look at this photo.
There's a lot of public that would like to get in here and there's empty seats.
Yep, they don't care about the public.
Oh, the camera. But I wonder why they wouldn't let the public into a public hearing.
Yeah.
With all the empty seats.
Oh, this must be the right place.
Yeah, and do you see all the people that
Today, we will examine how immigration policy is carried out at the federal, state, and local levels in Minnesota and across the country. We're going to examine whether failures of coordination or communication contributed to the events that followed. Anytime an American citizen is shot in the streets of this country, it's a tragedy. That's true whether the individual is a private citizen exercising their constitutional rights or a law enforcement officer performing official duties. Loss of life demands scrutiny, not spin. In Minnesota, sharply conflicting accounts have emerged, so we want to get to the truth today. State and local officials tell one story, federal officials tell another story. Depending on the media source, the public may hear only one side. The hearing today, though, is to evaluate the facts and not to defend any one particular narrative. We will hear from two panels. First, leaders from Minnesota will describe conditions on the ground, the level of cooperation with federal authorities, and how tensions escalated. Second, leaders from CBP and ICE will explain the challenges of conducting enforcement operations under intense public scrutiny. We've also heard repeated claims that Minnesota, or Minneapolis in particular, is a so-called sanctuary jurisdiction. That term is often loosely applied and means different things to different people, but we want to explore what that means and whether it's part of the problem today. State and local officials dispute that the characterization. Federal officials cite limits on the cooperation. Not every state operates this way. We don't seem to have this tension or problem between state and federal government and other states. Why? We need to understand what cooperation actually looks like in Minnesota and how it can be better. We need to look where communication has failed, and we need to determine whether this was a failure of policy, coordination, or leadership on one side or both sides. In a free society, filming government officials in public is a constitutional right. It's not an act of aggression. Americans are led to believe, excuse me in the back, Americans are led to believe that exercising the right of being there and protesting shouldn't place them at the risk of lethal force. If it does, public trust collapses. At the same time, federal officials made public statements implying that firearms are prohibited at protests. Those statements were later clarified, but they're erroneous and not helpful. The First and Second Amendment are not suspended during periods of unrest or during protests. When officials speak imprecisely or rashly about constitutional limits, especially in volatile moments, they risk inflaming the situation rather than stabilizing it. Law enforcement officers perform difficult and dangerous work, and the vast majority do so honorably. But when a shooting occurs, the proper response is not to dismiss concerns or rush to judgment. Traditionally, the officers are removed from the line, even in very justified shootings, even in shootings when they've been shot at multiple times, wounded, The officers typically removed in this investigation because we think lethal force is such a thing that should be controlled and restricted that we always investigate it. That's what needed to happen here and should happen. The process protects both the public and the law enforcement officers. But we must avoid on all sides is just resorting to inflammatory rhetoric, declaring nothing to see here, or rushing to label a U.S. citizen a domestic terrorist before the evidence is established undermines trust and escalates already volatile situations. Both parties have weaponized the term domestic terrorist to target those with opposing views, and it needs to end. Many Americans have seen the videos. Many see an individual retreating. Many see someone attempting to assist a woman on the ground before being seized from behind. Reasonable people may disagree about those videos, but the truth must be determined by evidence, not narrative. I support immigration and customs enforcement. I believe dangerous criminals should be removed from our communities. But in order for ICE to be successful, they must restore public trust. We must acknowledge when federal agents are placed in chaotic crowd control situations that the risk of tragedy increases. At the same time, state and local decisions that limit cooperation affect how and where federal enforcement is carried out. Escalatory statements from any level of government only make it worse. Reports that cooperation in Minnesota is improving and that agents will return to their normal assignments and be repositioned outside of Minnesota are encouraging. Restoring trust, however, requires more than assurances. It requires independent review, clear standards for the use of force, and honest accountability. A government that values liberty must be willing to examine its own actions. That is how we protect civil liberties, that's how we protect law enforcement, and that's how we protect against future loss of life. Senator Peters.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for convening today's hearing. In communities all across the country, Americans have seen on video with their own eyes as law enforcement officers from the Department of Homeland Security have tackled and beaten U.S. citizens in the streets, as they've broken windows and yanked U.S. citizens from their cars, as they've been pepper sprayed in the face at point blank, and as they have shot and killed 2 U.S. citizens, Renee Good and Alex Preedy, who were exercising their First Amendment rights. In Mr. Preedy's case, his Second Amendment rights. These actions have been carried out by masked federal officers without appropriate identification and near areas like schools and houses of worship, where innocent children are often present and placed in harm's way. While all Americans agree that we should remove violent criminals who pose a threat to public safety as part of immigration enforcement, we all agree at that. But most Americans also overwhelmingly agree that the administration's violent and heavy-handed tactics are an abuse of power, and they must be reined in. Today's hearing comes at a critical time, as Congress has a chance to put needed reforms in place to hold DHS law officials and enforcement officers who supervise them accountable. And I'm grateful that today the committee and the American people will have a chance to hear not only from state officials from the state of Minnesota, but most importantly from key agency officials within the DHS who oversee the officers carrying out the actions that we have all seen on the ground in communities like Minneapolis. I look forward to hearing testimony from these DHS officials, but at the end of the day, they all answer to Secretary Noem. She must also fulfill her responsibility to testify before this committee, and more importantly, the American people, for the lawless and unconstitutional behavior that some DHS officers have carried out under her leadership. Today, we're going to hear a lot of explanations and justifications from federal officials, and I'm sure we'll hear accusations about communities like Minneapolis and what the Trump administration thinks their obligations are when it comes to immigration enforcement. But let's be clear, immigration enforcement is solely the responsibility of the federal government. We'll hear today from state officials in Minnesota who will shine a light on how they cooperate with ICE despite the administration's rhetoric to the contrary. Instead of working cooperatively with the state and local enforcement on these operations, through their chaotic and dangerous engagements, the Trump administration has undermined all trust between communities and federal law enforcement. In doing so, they have made it harder for local police to protect public safety and address crime in their communities. On top of that, the DHS has also broken trust with the American people to the point where we can no longer believe the words and information the department is putting out. For example, in the aftermath of the horrific shooting deaths of Renee Good and Alex Preddy at the hands of DHS officers, Secretary Noem and other officials rushed to smear two citizens exercising their First Amendment rights as violent threats and as domestic terrorists. DHS and White House officials used these words, spun a narrative that falsely painted the victims as violent agitators, and tried to manipulate the truth about what actually happened on the ground. And they did this despite the fact that there were multiple videos that have allowed all of us to see with our own eyes, what actually happened. That Americans who posed no threat were shot and killed in our streets by representatives of the federal government. However, despite the efforts of the Trump administration to spin lies, like most Americans, I believe the truth still matters. I believe that every federal law enforcement officer has a responsibility to conduct their work in a professional manner and in accordance with the law. And I believe that when they don't, whether it is an individual officer or a high-ranking official from the Department of Homeland Security, they must be held accountable for their actions. Today's hearing is about holding DHS accountable for the terror that they have unleashed in our communities through these violent, excessive, and unprofessional tactics. And as I said before, I expect to hear more excuses than admissions of error from the DHS officials. So with that in mind, I want to remind everyone exactly what we're talking about today. Got a brief video. If you'd put the brief video up, this is what we're talking about today.
Yeah, right in my information down. Because we're investing in Vertex. Oh, good. And they're considered domestic terrorists. So.
Mr. Chairman, I also ask unanimous consent to submit letters I have received from stakeholders in the committee's record.
Without objection.
Thank you.
Tom Emmer represents Minnesota's 6th Congressional District and serves as the House Majority Whip. Because of his other duties after his testimony, I think he probably will be headed back to the House, but we appreciate you coming over. Congressman Emmer, you are recognized for your opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Paul, Ranking Member Peters, and members of the committee for this opportunity. It's not every day a lowly House member gets to address the upper chamber. I also want to acknowledge the other witnesses, constituent and friend Majority Leader Harry Niska, as well as Commissioner Snell and Attorney General Ellison, for being willing to offer their insight into this very important issue. I look forward to Attorney General Ellison being forced to answer for his role in tying the hands of law enforcement in order to protect criminals. It's a shame that his partner in crime, Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey, declined the invitation to testify here today. Frey clearly has no problem talking about Minneapolis to any member of the media who will listen, so it makes you wonder if he's too afraid to repeat those same lies under oath. I guess time will tell. As the representative of Minnesota's 6th Congressional District, I have witnessed firsthand the consequences that come when our Democrat state leaders prioritize criminal illegal aliens over law-abiding Minnesotans. The unrest that we all watched unfold in Minneapolis over recent weeks was unnerving. It was heartbreaking, and any loss of life is tragic. But make no mistake, it was all a direct result of radical sanctuary state and city policies in Minnesota. By preventing local law enforcement from working together with federal law enforcement, they have turned Minnesota into a safe haven for criminal illegal aliens. We're talking about murderers, rapists, gang members, and child predators. Now, before you hear dizzying spin from one of the other witnesses here today, let's take a closer look at how we got here. In 2021, with Attorney General Keith Ellison as the chief law enforcement officer in our state, the Hennepin County Sheriff's Office issued a directive which prohibited the county's cooperation with immigration and customs enforcement. 4 years later, Ellison issued 2 legal opinions arguing that Minnesota law prohibits state and local law enforcement agencies from holding someone based on an immigration detainer if the person would otherwise be released from custody, and limiting county sheriff's ability to enter into 287G cooperation agreements with federal law enforcement. What happened as a result? Criminal illegal aliens were released back onto our streets, putting innocent Minnesotans' lives at risk. Take the case of Victoria Aline Harwell, for example, a Minnesota mom who was allegedly killed by an illegal alien in a drunk driving car crash. Hennepin County ignored detainer requests and let this criminal walk not once, but twice, citing Attorney General Ellison's opinion. Flash forward to December 2025, when the Trump administration launched Operation Metro Surge in Minneapolis, fulfilling the border security mandate they were given by 77 million Americans and following the uncovering of rampant Somali fraud throughout our state. As of last week, 4,000 illegal aliens have been arrested since Operation Metro Surge began. That includes the worst of the worst off our streets. But in response, Tim Walz and Keith Ellison sued the Department of Homeland Security for simply deploying federal law enforcement to enforce federal law. That lawsuit was ultimately rejected by a Biden-appointed federal judge, and now Trump border czar Tom Homan has been working with Minnesota officials to scale back Operation Metro Surge on the condition that local law enforcement be allowed to cooperate with federal law enforcement. Something, by the way, that occurred under the President Obama's administration. It's important to note that it didn't have to be this way. The chaos in Minneapolis was entirely preventable had the local law enforcement been allowed to work with federal law enforcement from the beginning. We see that in states like Texas, Florida, Utah. We also see that in 8 Minnesota counties, including Sherburne County, which is in my district. Sherburne and these 7 counties have proactively partnered with federal law enforcement to prevent criminal illegal aliens from roaming free, despite threats of ridiculous lawsuits by the ACLU arising from Attorney General Ellison's dangerous guidance. It's really that simple. By allowing local law enforcement to notify federal law enforcement when they arrest illegal aliens and detain them until a federal officer can come and get them, we limit the Fed's footprint and keep dangerous criminals off our streets. It's a win-win for all parties involved. But Tim Walz, Keith Ellison, and Jacob Fry are so beholden to their radical sanctuary state and city agenda that they've lost all common sense. And now here we are today with innocent lives lost and chaos in our streets. It's horrible, but entirely preventable. And it makes you wonder, why are Minnesota Democrats so keen on protecting criminal illegal aliens? Is it so that they can secure votes come election season? Tim Walz, after all, refuses to hand over Minnesota's voter rolls to the Department of Justice. And Keith Ellison has a history of cutting deals with Somali fraudsters for personal, political, and financial gain. These are all very important questions, and I hope we can get some clarification on all of them today. Minnesotans deserve answers and accountability. Thank you for allowing me to testify on behalf of all the hardworking, law-abiding Minnesotans. We're grateful for your commitment to uncovering the truth and ensuring that justice be served. I yield back.
Congressman Emmer, thank you for your statement and for your participation today. It's the practice of this committee to swear in witnesses. Will each of the remaining witnesses rise and raise your right hand? Do you swear that the testimony you will give before this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? You may be seated. Our first witness will be Harry Niska, who represents District 31A in the Minnesota House of Representatives and serves as the Republican floor leader. Representative Niska, you are recognized for your opening statement.
Chairman Paul, Ranking Member Peters, and members of this committee. My name is Harry Niska. I serve in the Minnesota House of Representatives. Thank you for the opportunity to present a perspective from Minnesota's immigration enforcement crisis. I want to start by expressing my appreciation for the recent recalibration of federal enforcement under Tom Homan. His commitment to rebuilding accountability and trust is essential, and we're already seeing a more focused and disciplined federal effort on the ground. But federal action only tells part of the story. Minnesota had been proud of our reputation for clean and good government, but recently we've become a cautionary tale of chaos, corruption, and fraud. And this decline is the result of specific policy choices made by Minnesota Democrats, especially related to immigration policy. First, they rolled out a welcome mat of benefits that erased the distinction between legal and illegal presence. In 2023, specifically under all Democrat control, Minnesota passed driver's licenses for all, explicitly including those without legal status, and even refused to include common sense measures like a label saying not eligible for voting. Minnesota created the North Star Promise, which provides free college tuition, including to illegal immigrants, and Minnesota extended taxpayer-funded health care and paid leave benefits to those here illegally. But beyond incentives, we face a graver issue in Minnesota: active nullification of federal law. Our Attorney General, Keith Ellison, issued an opinion blocking the use of 287G agreements, the gold standard for federal-state law enforcement cooperation. And in another opinion, he provided legal cover for sheriffs who want to ignore ICE detainers. The results are stark. In some counties, ICE detainers are complied with, but in Hennepin County, our largest jurisdiction featuring Minneapolis, the sheriff's office complied with only 8% of ICE detainer requests over a 2-year period. This obstruction has a cost. When jails refuse to honor detainers, they don't stop enforcement, they displace it. Arresting a suspect in the secure environment of a jail is safe and efficient. Forcing that arrest to happen in a home or a workplace, or what we saw just this week in the lobby of the Hennepin County Courthouse, drastically increases the risk to officers and the public. When Minnesota local law enforcement officials, the Hennepin County attorney, thinks it's better to release someone caught with 50 pounds of meth in January and release them out into the community, and ICE has to arrest them in the lobby of the Hennepin County Courthouse, which is what happened yesterday. That is what causes the chaos that we've seen in Minneapolis. And the Minneapolis Police Department has refused to assist even in crowd control during these types of chaotic situations. That's what resulted in the 2 tragic deaths that we heard about earlier today. And we will never know, sadly, how those 2 situations had turned out if Minneapolis police had been permitted by their political leaders, like Governor Walz, Attorney General Ellison, and Mayor Frey, to simply keep the peace, rather than forcing federal law enforcement officials into a chaotic situation. The rule of law must include enforcing federal immigration law. It must be done within the bounds of the law. But simply withdrawing federal enforcement at a heckler's veto because of those who are opposed to enforcing the law would only validate nullification and encourage further lawlessness. Thank you for the opportunity to testify.
Keith Ellison is the Attorney General of the state of Minnesota. Attorney General Ellison, you are recognized for your opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Paul, and thank you, Ranking Member. Thank you, Chairman Paul, and thank you, Ranking Member Peters, and thank you to all members of the committee. I'm Keith Ellison, and I'm the Minnesota Attorney General. Since early December, Minnesota has been the site of Operation Metro Surge, the largest single deployment of ICE agents in the history of the United States, the largest single immigration enforcement surge our country has ever seen. The surge has caused real harm to our state. Members of the committee, I respectfully ask you to exercise your oversight powers to do the following things. 1, require ICE to provide a full, transparent accounting of everyone stopped, detained, arrested, and deported from Minnesota during Operation Metro Surge. 2, require ICE to document the conditions of its detention facilities and to allow attorneys, healthcare professionals, clergy, and elected officials full access. 3, require the FBI to conduct investigations in partnership with Minnesota into the deaths of Renee Good and Alex Preddy and into every other use of excessive force. 4, require ICE to stop masking, stop the racial profiling, stop conducting warrantless searches. And finally, pass comprehensive immigration reform. I was so encouraged years ago when Senator Langford was leading that effort. It needs to be renewed. One question any rational person might ask is why? Why is this happening? Because it simply doesn't really make sense. Every rationale the administration has offered for this surge is really a pretext. The government has said the purpose of the surge is to fight unauthorized immigration, yet Minnesota ranks 28th among all states in the percentage of undocumented immigrants. Florida and Texas alone have nearly as many undocumented people as the entire population of the state of Minnesota. The government has said the purpose of the surge is to fight fraud in government programs. Well, of course, I hate fraud, and my office and I are already fighting it. We've convicted 300 people of Medicaid fraudsters in the last 7 years. The government did not surge, however, forensic accountants to Minnesota. They didn't surge computer experts. Instead, they sent 3,000 masked, armed men who are now kicking in doors, demanding papers, killing Minnesotans, not fighting fraud. The surge has hurt the fight against fraud. Because of it, a wave of experienced prosecutors have left the U.S. Attorney's Office.
However, it shouldn't be a partisan issue that you arrest public safety threats in the safety and security of a jail. Releasing public safety threats back in the public is just stupid. And I've been arguing this for years. And I hope Congress takes action on sanctuary cities and sanctuary states. It makes sense. If you think about it, even the argument I hear, well, victims and witnesses of crime that are in the country illegally want to feel safe to come to law enforcement and to report those crimes without fearing that this law enforcement agency is working with ICE. That's a bunch of crap. Because victims and witnesses of crime don't want the bad guy released to the neighborhood either.